Tonight, we're going to spend a little while inside a world that most people only ever picture in the dark. A world of black bread and thin soup, of wood smoke drifting slowly up through the rafters and out into a grey morning sky. A world of a single earthenware pot bubbling over a fire that never quite goes out, from one year to the next. The so-called Dark Ages. 5 long centuries between the fall of Rome and the turn of the first millennium, when the lights of empire had dimmed, the roads had begun to crumble, and the great libraries had fallen quiet. We call it the Dark Ages, and the name has a way of painting the whole period in shadow. When we imagine it at all, we imagine hardship. Cold huts, empty bellies, people living short, grim, hungry lives in a Europe that had somehow forgotten everything Rome once knew. But here's the thing about that darkness. It wasn't nearly as empty as we've been led to believe. And nowhere is that clearer, nowhere more human and more surprising than at the table. Because whatever else was happening in those 500 years, the migrations, the kingdoms rising and falling, the monasteries copying their manuscripts by candlelight, people still had to eat. Every single day. And the story of how they did it is far warmer, far stranger, and far more alive than the phrase Dark Ages would ever let you guess. So before we begin, settle in somewhere comfortable. Dim the lights if you like. Pull something soft around your shoulders. There is nothing here to hurry through, and nothing you need to remember or do. We're simply going to wander, slowly and at our own pace, through 1,000 ordinary meals eaten by ordinary people more than 1,000 years ago. Think of it as a long, unhurried walk through a vanished world, stopping wherever there's something good to look at. We'll start down in the muddy fields with the peasants, the men and women who, with their own hands and backs, grew very nearly everything that anyone in this world ever ate. We'll warm ourselves at their fire and look into their pot. Then we'll climb gradually upward, into the timber halls of lords, where the fires burned larger and the tables ran longer. Into the hushed dining rooms of monks, where holy men argued with wonderful seriousness about exactly what a person was allowed to swallow. And finally, up to the very top, to the tables of kings, where the truth turns out to be almost the opposite of the legend. And all along the way, at each stop on our journey, we'll gather up small facts, 100 of them in all. Little glimpses of what these people put in their bowls, how they grew it and hunted it and foraged for it, how they kept it from rotting through the long, cold winters, in a world with no ice and no tins and no refrigeration of any kind. Why they believed certain foods could heal them and others could make them ill. And again, what a single mouthful could quietly announce about exactly where a person stood in the great ladder of the world. Because in the early Middle Ages, food was never only food. It was medicine, prescribed by doctors according to ancient theories about the balance of the body. It was religion, governed by a calendar of fasts and feasts that shaped what half of Europe ate on any given day. It was law and status, and politics and memory, and above all, survival. What landed on your plate, or far more often in your plain wooden bowl, announced who you were and where you belonged before you had spoken so much as a single word. So let's begin where very nearly everyone began. At the bottom, in the fields in the grey light before dawn, beside a fire and a pot. Before we crouch down beside that first peasant fire, it's worth taking just a moment to understand a few things that shaped every meal in this world, at every level of society. Because the people of the early Middle Ages didn't think about food the way we do. They ate by different rules, believed different things about what was healthy, and lived inside a landscape that decided a great deal of what was even possible. The first thing to understand is just how local this world was. This was a fragmented Europe, with the great unifying machinery of Rome long since fallen away, and its food economies were overwhelmingly local ones. What a person ate depended enormously on precisely where they stood on the map, on the soil beneath their feet, the climate over their head, and the season turning around them. The diet of a Norse farmer on a windswept Danish coast in the 9th century was a radically different thing from the diet of a farmer in sunny southern Francia. There was no single medieval diet. There were 1,000 of them, each shaped by its own small patch of earth. But beneath all that variety, one ingredient reigned supreme everywhere for everyone. Grain. Cereal grains were the absolute backbone of the diet across the whole of this world, and by some estimates, they made up as much as 3/4 of what the average person ate by the 9th century. Wheat, barley, rye, oats, these were not merely ingredients. They were the very foundation of life, the thing that stood between a community and starvation. We'll return to this simple, powerful truth right at the very end of our journey, because in a sense, it's the deepest fact of all. But it's worth holding in your mind from the very start. Whatever else was on the table, grain was underneath it. Then there was the matter of health, and here the medieval mind worked in a way that can seem strange to us, but which had its own deep and careful logic. Nearly everyone with any education believed in what was called humoral theory. It was an idea inherited from the ancient Greek physicians, from Hippocrates and from Galen, and it had traveled a long road down through the centuries and through the Arab world before settling firmly into the medieval imagination. The theory held that the human body was governed by 4 fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that good health depended entirely on keeping these 4 in a proper, delicate balance. Each humor was associated with a pairing of qualities: hot or cold, moist or dry. And here is the crucial part for our story. Every single food was thought to carry these same qualities. A food could be hot and dry, or cold and moist, and so on. Which meant that eating was never just eating. It was medicine. It was a constant, careful act of adjusting the balance of your own body. A good physician could recommend particular foods to correct an imbalance, or warn a patient away from foods that might tip them further out of true. This is why, for instance, people were so wary of raw vegetables, which were often thought to be dangerously cold and moist, and why cooking, applying the hot, drying power of fire, was seen as making food not just tastier, but genuinely safer and healthier. The ideal diet, many believed, was one that was moderately warm and moist, gently matching the perceived needs of the human body. When we watch these people salting their meat, or spicing their wine, or boiling their cabbage soft, we are watching not just cooks, but amateur physicians, tending to the invisible balance within. And finally, there was the shape of the meal itself, and the great engine that governed it, the church. The Christian calendar was studded with fast days, days on which meat was forbidden, and with feast days, on which abundance was permitted and even encouraged. Between them, these two kinds of holy days imposed a rhythm on the eating of the entire society, rich and poor alike. We'll see this rhythm again and again as we travel upward through the classes, because it touched every single one of them. The peasant, the lord, the monk, and the king all lived their eating lives inside the same great turning wheel of fasting and feasting. So keep these few things in the back of your mind as we go. The intense localness of it all, the quiet supremacy of grain, the strange logic of the humors, and the steady beat of the holy calendar. With those in hand, we're ready. Let's finally crouch down beside that fire and look into that first, humble part. One last thing worth saying before we set off. It's tempting, when we look back at people who lived so long ago and so differently from us, to imagine them as somehow simpler than we are, as figures in a faded painting, going through dim and joyless motions. But that would be a mistake, and an unkind one. These were people every bit as clever, as funny, as proud, and as fully alive as anyone you'll meet today. They took real pleasure in a good meal. They knew the deep comfort of a warm bowl of something on a cold night, the small triumph of a well-brewed batch of ale, the joy of a feast after a long stretch of plain days. They argued about food, and boasted about it, and shared it, and remembered it. When we look into their parts, and their bowls, and their cups over the next little while, we're not looking at something quaint or primitive. We're looking at ourselves, 1,000 years back, doing one of the most human things there is. Keep that in mind, and the whole world we're about to enter will feel a great deal warmer and a great deal closer than its shadowy name would ever suggest. Imagine, for a moment, that you are a peasant somewhere in early medieval Europe. It doesn't much matter exactly where. A valley in Francia, a hillside in Anglo-Saxon England, a farmstead somewhere along the Rhine. The particulars change from place to place, but the rhythm of your stomach does not. You wake before dawn, not because you're disciplined, but because the light is precious and the work is endless. Your house is small and dim, a single room, most likely, with an earthen floor packed hard by generations of feet, walls of timber and woven wattle sealed with daub, and a roof of thatch above your head. There is no chimney. The smoke from the fire finds its own slow way up through the rafters, which is why the underside of that thatch is black and glossy, with years of gathered soot. The air smells of wood smoke and damp earth, and underneath it all, of something warm and starchy and faintly sour. And the first thing you think about, even before your feet touch the cold floor, is the part. Because in your house, as in very nearly every house in this world, there is almost always a part. Your day, like the days of nearly everyone around you, will be shaped by two great forces, the land and the light. There is no clock on your wall, no calendar pinned beside the door. Time is told by the sun climbing over the fields, by the slow procession of the seasons, and by the bells of the nearest church drifting across the valley to mark the hours of prayer. Your work is endless and physical, ploughing, sowing, weeding, reaping, tending animals, mending, hauling, and all of it burns a tremendous amount of energy. A laboring body in this world needs a great deal of fuel simply to keep going. and so the question of food is never very far from your mind. It sits there, quietly, beneath everything else you do. What is there to eat now? What will there be to eat this winter? Will the harvest come in? These are not idle questions. They are the deepest questions of your life. Fact 1. The single most important object in a peasant's kitchen was the cooking pot, and the single most important meal that came out of it was pottage. Pottage was a thick, slow-cooked mixture of grains, vegetables, and whatever else could be spared, simmered patiently in a cauldron over the fire. It was eaten by nearly everyone in the early medieval world, from the poorest cottager in his one-room hut to, in far grander and fancier forms, the royal family itself. If one single dish could be said to define the entire period, one food to stand for 500 years, it would be this humble, bubbling pot of boiled goodness. Picture it hanging there on its iron chain over the glowing embers, a dark, dented cauldron, its contents murmuring softly to themselves all day long. Fact 2. For the medieval poor, the pot never truly stopped. It was replenished, reused, and reimagined day after day, week after week. Fresh water went in as the level dropped. More grain went in whenever there was grain to spare. Whatever the garden or the forest or the hedgerow happened to offer that particular day went in as well. And the whole thing simply kept on simmering, low and slow, over a fire that was rarely allowed to die out completely. It was, in a very real sense, a single continuous meal that never truly ended, a warm, living, bubbling heart at the very center of the home, carrying the family forward from one gray day to the next. Fact 3. The ingredients of that pottage shifted constantly with the seasons, and to look down into the pot was almost to read a calendar. In the warm months, fresh herbs, tender young leeks, and green leafy things went in, lending the pottage brightness and color and a sharp, living flavor. In the depths of winter, when the gardens were bare and the world outside was hard with frost, it was dried peas, stored oats, and a few wrinkled roots from the store that carried the whole weight of survival on their shoulders. The pot told you the time of year as surely and as honestly as the bare or budding trees just outside the door. Fact 4. And archaeologists have found the physical proof of all this, still lying in the ground where it fell more than 1,000 years ago. At early medieval village sites, they have recovered charred fragments of legumes and barley grains from the remains of old hearths, the burnt, blackened crumbs of countless pottages, cooked in iron cauldrons suspended over open fires, simmering slowly through the day as workers came and went from the fields, dipping a bowl whenever hunger struck, and then returning to their labor. This wasn't merely something written down in a book by a distant scribe. It was lived and eaten and dropped into the fire, one ordinary bowl at a time. Fact 5. In 2019, scientists at the University of Bristol did something quietly remarkable. They took ancient pottery fragments from one of England's earliest medieval villages, a place called West Carton, and chemically analyzed the fats and oils that were still, astonishingly, clinging to the porous surface of the clay after 1,000 years buried in the soil. And for the very first time, they found definitive, physical, molecular evidence of what these peasants had actually cooked and eaten. What they found was pottage, stews of meat and vegetables, confirming beyond doubt that the humble one-part meal really had been the genuine mainstay of the peasant diet. Not a guess, not a stereotype. The real thing read straight from the greasy, faithful memory of the pot itself. Fact 6. Those same Bristol researchers discovered that the pottages had contained mutton and beef, cooked together with vegetables like cabbage and leek. So the familiar image of the peasant as a pure and joyless vegetarian, gnawing endlessly on roots and green stuff and nothing more, isn't quite right after all. A little meat did find its way into the pot, a bone here, a scrap of mutton there, enough to lend the broth some richness and depth. Just usually not very much of it, and only very rarely as the main event of the meal. Meat, for the peasant, was mostly a seasoning rather than a centerpiece. Fact 7. The study also revealed the quiet, unglamorous importance of dairy. Traces of what were most likely green cheeses. Soft, fresh, simple cheeses of the sort known to have been eaten by ordinary country people showed up clearly in the peasant diet. Cheese, milk, buttermilk, and other dairy products played a far larger and steadier role in keeping poor families fed and nourished than the old stereotypes ever allowed. The cow, the goat, and the humble ewe were, in their quiet way, every bit as important to survival as the field of grain. Now, alongside the pot, there was always bread. Always, always bread. It sat at the very center of life in this world. But the bread of the peasant was a very different creature from the soft, pale, pillowy loaf you might be picturing. Fact 8. Peasant bread was dark, dense, and coarse. It was made not from fine golden wheat, but from whatever grew and reliably survived in a hard climate, usually a mix of rye, barley, and oats. The result was a heavy, close-grained, chewy loaf, far more about filling the belly and sustaining a laboring body through long hours in the fields than about any delicacy of flavor. You didn't nibble at it politely. You tore it, and it filled you. It was survival you could hold in your two hands. Fact 9. This dark, mixed-grain bread even had its own name in some places. A darker, coarser loaf, made from a blend of grains such as barley and rye rather than pure wheat, was known as maslin. And it stood in direct, visible contrast to the fine white bread of the wealthy. You could read a person's station at a glance, simply from the color of the bread in their hand. In bread, as in so very much else in this world, inequality was quite literally baked right in. Fact 10. When the harvest failed, and in the early Middle Ages, the harvest failed often, and sometimes terribly, bread became a place of desperate, resourceful creativity. Peasants stretched their dwindling flour with whatever fillers they could lay their hands on. Ground-up acorns went in. Dried beans and peas were milled and added. In the very worst and hungriest years, according to some accounts, people were reduced to adding things like bark and even sawdust, simply to bulk out the dough and make the precious grain last a little longer. Hunger has a way of making inventive bakers out of the most unlikely and unpromising ingredients. Fact 11. In many manors across this world, peasants weren't even permitted to bake their own bread in their own homes. They were required, by the custom and law of the manor, to bring their kneaded dough to the Lord's great oven and bake it there, and naturally, they were charged a fee for the privilege of doing so. Even the simple, ancient, deeply human act of turning your own grain into your own bread came with a small toll to be paid to the man who happened to own the land beneath your feet. Fact 12. These lords' ovens and the shared communal ovens of the villages were often massive stone structures that held their heat beautifully, radiating warmth long after the fire inside had been raked out. One good firing could bake many batches of loaves in succession, one family's bread after another's, all through the day. And so baking was frequently a communal affair, a slow, warm, sociable gathering point in the daily rhythm of village life, where neighbors met, and news was traded, and the good smell of fresh loaves hung in the air while everyone waited patiently for their turn. Let's think now about the vegetables, the green things and the roots and the beans that filled out the pot and crowded the little garden plots behind each cottage. Fact 13. Here is a small and rather lovely linguistic curiosity. In England, for most of this entire period, the word vegetable simply did not exist in the way we use it today. It didn't enter common English use until the early 15th century, right at the tail end of the medieval world. Before that, edible plants of every kind were all lumped together under a single, gentle, all-embracing word. Herbs. Your cabbage was a herb. Your leek was a herb. Your humble onion was a herb. It's a small thing, but it quietly changes the texture of the whole world. A world where everything green that you could eat was, in a sense, simply a herb of the garden. Fact 14. And that early medieval garden was a surprisingly varied and generous place for anyone who had the land and the labor to tend one. The plants grown and eaten included onions, garlic, leeks, parsnips, fennel, parsley, shallots, watercress, lettuce, beetroot, carrots, broad beans, peas, lentils, and cabbages of several kinds. It was not, as we so often imagine, a barren and colorless world of gray gruel and nothing else. For anyone with even a scrap of soil to work, a real and genuine spectrum of flavors, textures, and colors was within reach, growing quietly just beyond the door. Fact 15. There was, however, a strange and telling class prejudice attached to certain vegetables, a kind of snobbery of the soil. Root vegetables, the things that grew down in the dark earth, were often considered unfit for noble tables and were thought of firmly as food for the poor. To eat what grew hidden underground was, in the eyes of the wealthy, to eat low, to eat too close to the dirt. And so your parsnips and your turnips, humble and sweet as they were, carried a quiet social stigma along with all their honest, earthy nourishment. Even a carrot, it seems, knew its place in the medieval order of things. Fact 16. People in this period were also deeply and genuinely wary of eating raw vegetables. Consuming plants raw was widely believed to cause illness and disease, and so vegetables were almost always cooked before they were eaten, boiled soft in the pot, stewed down to tenderness, thoroughly subdued by heat and time. The very idea of a fresh, crisp, raw salad, which we prize so highly today, would have struck a great many early medieval people as faintly reckless, even a little dangerous. Better, they thought, to let the fire do its safe and civilizing work first. Fact 17. Legumes were the quiet, unsung heroes of the entire peasant diet. Peas and broad beans, dried carefully at summer's end and stored away in sacks and jars, were absolutely central to survival. They could be kept through the long winter without spoiling. They could be thrown by the handful into the ever-simmering pottage. Or they could be boiled slowly down into a thick, filling, heartening peas pudding, a substantial dish made from dried peas that delivered precious, life-sustaining protein at exactly those times of the year when meat was nowhere to be found at all. In a world so often short on flesh, the small, unglamorous pea did an absolutely enormous amount of quiet work to keep people alive and on their feet. Now, beyond the garden gate lay the woods, the hedgerows, the streams, and all the wild and tangled places. And for the peasant, these were nothing less than a second pantry, free, open, and generous to anyone with the knowledge, the sharp eyes, and the patience to gather from them. Fact 18. Because most people in this period lived rurally, out on the land rather than in towns, the wild landscape was always close at hand, never more than a short walk from the door. And this meant that foraging was a genuine and important part of eating, not some quaint hobby. People gathered wild fruits, hazelnuts and other nuts, mushrooms and fungi, and all manner of wild plants and herbs from the countryside around them, steadily supplementing the garden and the pot with the free, unbidden gifts of the land. To know your local woods and hedges intimately, to know which berry ripened when, and where the good mushrooms rose after rain, was a real and valuable form of wealth. Fact 19. Wild mushrooms in particular were prized and gathered enthusiastically. They grew abundantly in the forests, the shady woodlands, and the damp corners of the medieval countryside, springing up overnight after autumn rains. And interestingly, they weren't only a peasant food at all. Even the nobility valued mushrooms for their rich, earthy flavor. But since almost no one in this period systematically cultivated them, they were nearly always gathered wild, plucked from beneath the dripping trees by those who knew exactly where to look, and who knew, just as importantly, which ones to leave well alone. Fact 20. In the very leanest years, when the crops failed entirely and the stores ran dry, whole communities were essentially thrown back into a hunter-gatherer way of life almost overnight. When the grain ran out, people survived however they could, trapping wild animals and foraging for pig nuts, berries, and edible leaves. The old, deep, half-forgotten skills of finding food in the wild suddenly became, once again, the difference between living and starving. In good years, the forest was a welcome luxury, a place of extra flavor and variety. In bad years, it became the last resort, the only thing standing between a family and the grave. Of course, we cannot talk about the peasant's table without talking about pork. Because if there was one single animal that truly belonged to the ordinary person in this world, it was the pig. Fact 21. The pig was the peasant's meat animal above all others, and for a beautifully practical reason. Pigs, more or less, fed themselves. They could simply be turned loose to forage in the local woods, where they fattened themselves up on the acorns and beech mast that showered down from the trees each autumn, food that people couldn't eat, but that pigs devoured with tremendous enthusiasm. This made pork remarkably cheap to raise, and it gave the poor a relatively steady, dependable supply of meat, of a kind that no other animal could match. Fact 22. The pig had another enormously convenient quality. It could be slaughtered at almost any time of year, unlike animals kept mainly for their wool or their milk, which you couldn't simply kill without losing their real value. A pig was, in effect, a walking larder, a living store of meat that you could keep and feed and fatten until the moment you needed it, and then turn into a whole season's worth of food in a single hard day's work. Fact 23. And when that day came, nothing whatsoever was wasted. When a pig was killed, even its blood was carefully caught and put to use. Pig's blood was collected and made into black pudding, a dark, dense, rich sausage that squeezed the very last drop of nourishment out of the animal. In a world where scarcity was always waiting just around the corner, the idea of throwing away something as nutritious and precious as blood would have seemed not just wasteful, but very nearly mad. Fact 24. Sheep were eaten too, in the form of mutton, but medieval sheep were most often kept primarily for their wool and their milk rather than their meat. As a result, by the time they were finally slaughtered, they were frequently so thin and worn that the meat they gave up was of poor and stringy quality. The peasant's mutton was a lean, tough, hard-won thing, chewed with effort and gratitude, a very long way indeed from the tender spring lamb we know today. Now let's turn to the thing that filled every cup. Because in the early Middle Ages, what people drank tells us very nearly as much as what they ate. Fact 25. The everyday drink of the peasantry was ale, and it was consumed by absolutely everyone, men, women, and even young children alike. But set aside any modern image you might have. This wasn't the strong, hoppy, bitter beer of a modern pub. Early medieval ale was weak, cloudy, brewed at home in small batches, and far closer to a kind of lightly fermented, nourishing grain drink than to anything you would ever find truly intoxicating. The best way to think of it is as liquid bread, a mild, slightly sweet, sustaining drink that happened to keep rather better than water did. Fact 26. Ale was genuinely regarded as food, as a real and valued part of daily nutrition, rather than as a luxury or an indulgence. It delivered calories, warmth, and a comforting sense of fullness to bodies worn down by hard physical labor. Large quantities of it were formally written into the food allowances that laborers received in exchange for their work. Nobody in this world thought of ale as a vice or a treat. It was simply part of the basic bundle of things a working body was understood to need in order to keep going. Fact 27. There's a persistent old story that medieval people drank ale purely because water was unsafe. And while that idea is often overstated, water quality really was a genuine and reasonable concern. Wells and streams close to settlements could easily be contaminated by human waste and by livestock. So a mild, fermented ale, brewed, crucially, with water that had been boiled, and carrying just a faint touch of alcohol, was in many places a more reliable, more comforting, and simply more pleasant choice than whatever murky offering the nearest stream happened to provide. Fact 28. Brewing, and this is a lovely and important detail, was overwhelmingly women's work. It was done at home by women who came to be known as alewives. And this matters enormously, because in a world that offered women vanishingly few paths to independence, brewing was one of the very few ways a woman could earn money that was genuinely her own. Some of the earliest independent businesswomen in all of European history were, quite literally, brewers of ale, selling their surplus to their neighbors and building a small livelihood from barley, water, and skill. Fact 29. Ale was so utterly central to survival that entire villages could depend on these women and the steady product of their brewing. When the ale in the house began to run low, families would carefully water down what little remained, stretching it further and further to make it last until the next brewing day. A jug of weak ale standing on the table meant one less thing to worry about in a life that was already crowded to the brim with worries. Fact 30. The brewing days themselves were long, hot, messy, and genuinely demanding. They consumed precious firewood, and they took real skill and experience to get right. A batch could easily be spoiled by carelessness or bad luck. But the reward at the end of all that labor, a fresh supply of safe, calorie-rich, comforting drink for the whole household, made every bit of the effort worthwhile. And in the process, it wove the alewife and her craft deep into the everyday fabric of village life. Let's pause here for a moment and think about the shape of the peasant's whole year. Because their eating followed the great turning wheel of the seasons with an intensity and an anxiety that we in our age of year-round supermarkets have very largely forgotten. Fact 31. For most of the year, peasant meals were repetitive and rough. The same pottage, the same dark bread, the same weak ale, day after day after day, sometimes for months on end without meaningful change. Eating was fundamentally about sustenance and rhythm, not about variety or pleasure. Which meant that the simple experience of a truly different meal, something new on the tongue, was a rare and genuinely treasured thing, a small event to be remembered. Fact 32. But the church, in its way, broke that monotony. Feast days, the religious holidays scattered generously throughout the calendar, were the bright moments when a peasant might taste something better than usual. A little meat, a slice of pie, perhaps something sweet, if only in modest amounts. In some years, there were more than 50 such feast days dotted across the year. They were small, recurring islands of abundance and rest, rising up out of an endless grey sea of routine and toil. Fact 33. On these days, a whole village might gather together for a shared communal meal, with everyone bringing along whatever small thing they could manage to contribute. It was never lavish, by any grand or noble standard, of course. But after long weeks and months of the very same grey pottage, a communal spread made up of everyone's little offerings felt like a genuine, joyful feast, precisely and entirely, because it wasn't the same old thing that sat in the pot at home. Fact 34. Of all the seasons, the autumn was the great hinge of the whole year, the pivot on which survival itself turned. This was the season of slaughter and of preservation, when the frantic, all-consuming work of putting food by for the long, cold months ahead reached its anxious peak. Everything, quite literally everything, depended on getting this right. Get it wrong, and the winter ahead could turn deadly. Fact 35. During the autumn pig harvest, families would eat as much fresh pork as they possibly could, in a brief and welcome window of feasting on cuts that simply wouldn't keep. And then they would salt and smoke absolutely everything else, transforming it into food that could carry them through to spring. The offal, which spoiled quickly and couldn't be preserved, was eaten right away in those first rich days. The rest was turned, through salt and smoke and patient work, into preserved meat that might last for months in the store. Fact 36. Only the animals genuinely needed for breeding the next year's stock were kept alive through the winter, their survival a careful gamble on the future. But in truly desperate years, Even those precious breeding animals had to be killed and eaten just to see the family through. And this created a devastating downward spiral. No surviving breeding stock meant no new animals born the following spring, and losing the oxen meant losing the very means to plow the fields and plant the next crop. In this way, a single catastrophic winter could reach its cold hand forward and ruin the years that came after it. Which brings us, quite unavoidably, to the shadow that hung over the whole of the peasant world: hunger. Fact 37. Hunger was a real and recurring presence in early medieval rural life, never far from the door and always liable to return. It arrived with harvest failures, with the passage of war and armies, with disease among people and livestock alike, and with the sometimes excessive demands of the lords, who took their appointed share regardless of how thin the year had been. The line between having just barely enough and having nothing at all was heartbreakingly thin, and every single person who worked the land understood it in their bones. Fact 38. And yet, and this really is important to hold on to, the peasant diet was not simply a grim catalogue of deprivation and want. The bleak popular image of nothing but endless black bread and perpetual near starvation is far too simple to be true. Bread, pottage, porridge, ale, peas, beans, onions, leeks, cabbage, roots, herbs, and seasonal greens together formed a diet that was monotonous, certainly, but very often genuinely adequate. It was not a diet of luxury, but it was a diet quietly and cleverly built to endure. Fact 39. In fact, in several real respects, the peasant diet was actually healthier than a typical modern one. There was little or no processed food of any kind, and far, far less sugar than we consume today. The heavy daily reliance on whole grains, on protein-rich legumes, and on garden vegetables gave ordinary working people a diet that a nutritionist today might well look upon with a certain quiet approval, assuming, of course, and it was always a very large assumption, that the harvest had actually come in that year. Fact 40. There is even solid documentary evidence that the Anglo-Saxon peasants were, on the whole, reasonably well fed. The heavy food rents recorded in the surviving documents, the substantial amounts of food that flowed through the system, strongly suggest that in normal, unremarkable years, ordinary working people got enough to eat to sustain long days of demanding physical labor. The Dark Ages, it turns out, often fed their workers considerably better than the shadowy name would ever lead us to imagine. And so we leave the fields behind us. We've filled the peasant's wooden bowl with steaming pottage, torn off a piece of dark, chewy bread, drunk down our mug of weak and cloudy ale, and watched the great wheel of the seasons turn all the way round, from the hope of planting, through the frantic labor of the autumn slaughter, to the long, anxious, hungry wait for spring. But before we climb the hill to the Lord's Hall, let's pause at the edge of the village and consider something that touched every single person in this world, from the poorest cottager to the king himself. Because in an age with no ice, no tins, and no refrigeration of any kind, the difference between life and death often came down to a single skill: the art of stopping food from rotting. Think, for a moment, about what it meant to face a northern European winter with no way to keep food cold. Everything that came from the autumn harvest and the autumn slaughter had to somehow be carried across 4 or 5 long, dark, barren months, during which almost nothing new would grow. The whole survival of a household turned on this. And so the people of the early Middle Ages became extraordinarily skilled at a handful of ancient techniques for cheating decay. Techniques so effective that we still use versions of them today, more for pleasure now than for survival. The first and greatest of these was salt. Salt was the master preservative of the entire medieval world. Rubbed thickly into meat, or dissolved into a strong brine bath in which fish and pork were submerged, salt drew the moisture out of food and made it a hostile place for the invisible agents of rot. Salted pork and salted herring became absolute staples of the winter months and of the church's fasting periods alike. The catch, of course, was that heavily salted food emerged tasting overwhelmingly of salt, far saltier than anything we would tolerate today, and often had to be soaked at length before it could be eaten. But a barrel of salt pork in the store was a barrel of survival, and few things mattered more. Salt was so important that it became a marker of status in its own right. Fine, clean, white salt graced the tables of the wealthy, while the poor made do with coarser, grayer, dirtier stuff. Remember that great salt cellar on the noble table, and the way one sat, above or below it. That single dish of seasoning carried a weight of meaning far beyond its size, precisely because salt itself was so quietly precious. The second great technique was smoke. Meat and fish, once salted, were often hung up in the smoke of a slow fire to dry and cure over days or even weeks. The smoke did more than dry the food. It carried its own subtle antimicrobial power, helping to hold decay at bay. In many houses, this happened naturally in the rafters, where the household fire's smoke, with no chimney to escape through, drifted constantly past the hanging meat. In grander establishments, dedicated smokehouses kept the process safely away from the living quarters. And the choice of wood mattered. In the north, oak and beech were favored, while further south, fruitwoods like apple and cherry lent their own gentle sweetness to the cure. Our modern love of bacon and smoked fish is a direct inheritance from this deep necessity, though our versions today are smoked and salted far more gently than the fierce, long-keeping originals ever were. The third technique was simple drying. Removing the water from food, whether by sun, by wind, or by the heat of a fire, was one of the oldest preservation methods of all. Fruits were dried and stored away, then used through the winter to sweeten pottages and sauces, to flavor festive dishes, and to supply a little brightness and goodness when no fresh fruit could possibly be had. Herbs were gathered at just the right moment, then carefully dried in bundles before they could blacken or mold, and hung up to season dishes, to treat illnesses, and even to scent a room through the cold months. In regions without enough reliable sun, communities built special, still houses, where fruits, herbs, and fish could be dried gently over a low fire, the heat and the smoke working together. And then there was fermenting and pickling, the deliberate, controlled use of transformation to hold food in a stable state. Vegetables and other foods could be soaked in brine or in vinegar, which preserved them and gave them a sharp, lasting tang. This same principle of controlled fermentation, of course, lay behind the ale and the mead and the cheese that filled the medieval world, food and drink that kept far better in their transformed state than the raw milk or grain or fruit ever could have on their own. To ferment something was, in a sense, to catch it at a useful moment and hold it there. There was even a thread of the humoral theory running through all of this. Spoilage itself was often understood as food becoming too cold and wet, and so the preserving techniques were seen as ways of restoring the opposite, more wholesome qualities. Salt was considered hot and drying. Smoking and drying added the dry quality that fought off decay. The medieval preserver, salting away the autumn's bounty, believed himself to be not merely storing food, but rebalancing its very nature, tipping it back toward the warm and the dry and away from the cold, wet corruption of rot. The logic wasn't quite ours, but the results, a full larder come midwinter, spoke for themselves. All of this work, this whole quiet art of keeping food alive, was the invisible foundation beneath every table we're about to visit. When the Lord sat down to his salted beef in February, or the monk to his preserved fish in Lent, or the king to his winter feast, they were all eating the fruits of this same patient, ancient skill. So let us carry that in mind now, as we finally leave the village behind and climb the hill toward the great timber hall of the man who owns the land. Cross the threshold of a lord's hall, and in theory at least, everything changes. The fire in the central hearth is far bigger, throwing its light up into the high rafters. The table is longer and covered with linen. There are hounds dozing on the rushes of the floor, and servants moving quietly between the benches. And the food, we are always told, was a world entirely apart, a groaning board of roasted meats and rare, costly delicacies, while the poor scraped by on their pottage in the cold outside. Some of that picture is perfectly true, but some of it, as we're about to discover, turns out to be one of the most persistent and surprising myths about the entire period. So let's step inside, warm ourselves at the great fire, and find out where the truth actually lies. Fact 41. For the medieval nobility, meat was not merely food. It was the single clearest possible statement of status a person could make. A diet visibly rich in meat announced your rank, and your power more loudly than any fine garment or gleaming ring ever could. The forests, the deer parks, and the rivers of a lord's estate were his own private larder, stocked with a bounty that was, by both law and long custom, kept firmly out of reach of the common people who lived and worked all around it. Fact 42. The true mark of a noble table, though, wasn't just any meat at all, but game, and above all others, venison. Deer meat was a delicacy reserved almost exclusively for the elite, and this was quite deliberate, because the right to hunt deer was tightly and jealously controlled from the very top of society. Venison, as a rule, wasn't something bought or sold in any market. It was hunted on your own land, or received as a gift from someone who had, which made a joint of it a pure and completely unmistakable badge of privilege, meat that money alone often couldn't even buy. Fact 43. Hunting itself was far, far more than a mere way of getting food onto the table. It was a beloved aristocratic pastime, a social ritual, and a powerful symbol of nobility in its own right. Great lords maintained private hunting grounds carefully stocked with deer, wild boar, hares, and game birds, pursuing them across the countryside with packs of trained hounds and with hawks upon the wrist. The chase itself was a grand performance of power and skill, and the meat that it produced at the end was, in every sense, the trophy of the day. Fact 44. Beyond venison, the noble table featured wild boar, a meat that was dangerous to obtain, deeply prestigious, and wonderfully dramatic to serve, along with the more familiar domestic meats like beef, pork, and lamb, prepared roasted on the spit, stewed slowly, or baked up into rich pies. And then there were the spectacular birds, pheasant and partridge for flavor, and reserved for only the very grandest of occasions, swan and even peacock, birds brought to the table quite as much for their astonishing, jaw-dropping appearance as for anything they offered to the tongue. Fact 45. Bread, too, drew a sharp and instantly visible line between the hall and the field. Where the peasant ate his dark, coarse maslin, the wealthy ate fine white bread, sometimes called manchet, made from carefully sifted wheat flour with all the bran and coarse matter removed. It was soft, clean, and beautifully pale, but achieving that paleness required extra milling and finer, more expensive grain, which made it both costly and labor-intensive to produce. The color of the bread in your hand was, in effect, the exact color of your status in the world. Fact 46. Within a great lord's household, the miller would produce several different grades of flour for different ranks of people, all ground from grain at the very same mill. The finest, whitest, most thoroughly sifted flour was set aside to make bread for the lord and his family at the high table. The coarser, browner, humbler flour was kept back for the servants in the lower household. And so, right there in the milling, before a single loaf had even been shaped or baked, the entire social order of the household was quietly being sorted out, grain by grain by grain. Now, the truly precious ingredients, the ones that separated a genuinely great lord from a merely comfortable one, came from very far away indeed. Fact 47. Spices were the ultimate luxury of the noble table, the crowning glory of elite cooking. Cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, and saffron were used generously and even lavishly in the kitchens of the wealthy, and they were staggeringly, almost unimaginably expensive, imported across enormous distances along the long and perilous trade routes that stretched all the way to the east. To season your food heavily and openly with these spices was to make a quiet but unmistakable announcement to everyone at the table that your wealth and your reach extended clear across the entire known world. Fact 48. Saffron in particular was worth quite literally its weight in gold, and it was prized every bit as much for its brilliant, glowing color as for its distinctive flavor. Nobles used it to dye their food a rich, radiant golden yellow, egg tarts that gleamed like sunlight, sauces that shone on the platter, because color itself, in this world, was a genuine form of display and delight. A golden dish set down upon the table was, in its own way, a small and edible boast, catching the firelight for all the assembled guests to admire. Fact 49. And these spices weren't only about taste and color either. Every use of costly pepper, every generous pinch of precious cinnamon was a visible, tangible sign that the host commanded resources most ordinary people would never so much as glimpse in a lifetime. The whole spice trade turned the noble kitchen into a kind of theater, and the spices themselves into the glittering props of power, proof, sprinkled right there over the meat, of just how far the lord's influence and money truly stretched. The lord's cup, too, was filled with something a good deal finer than the peasant's watery, homely ale. Fact 50. While good ale still had its honored place even at the noble table, the drink of real prestige, the one that truly marked a table as elite, was wine, and specifically high-quality wine, very often imported from France. Wine was more expensive than ale, more refined in taste, and it carried with it a lingering air of Roman and Mediterranean sophistication, an echo of the classical world that plain local grain ale simply could never hope to match. Fact 51. Among the wealthy, wine was also frequently transformed into more elaborate and luxurious drinks. One particular favorite was Hippocras, red wine that had been spiced and sweetened, rather like a warm mulled wine, served as a comforting, aromatic, luxurious treat, especially in the colder months. And the very act of adding costly, imported spices to already costly, imported wine amounted to a wonderful double display of abundance, a way of layering one expensive pleasure directly on top of another. Let's talk now about how these people actually ate, the physical, practical business of dining in a great hall, which was a surprisingly communal and hands-on affair, quite unlike our own neat and separate modern place settings. Fact 52. For much of this period, the wealthy ate their food off a trencher, and here's the thing, originally a trencher wasn't a plate at all, but a thick, flat round of stale bread, usually cut from the bottom of an old loaf. Food was piled up directly onto this edible platter, which then soaked up all the rich juices and sauces steadily as the meal went on. The trencher was, in a very real sense, one of the most practical plates ever invented. Not only did it hold your dinner, but you could go ahead and eat it afterward, sauce and all. Fact 53. And at the end of the meal, that sauce-soaked bread trencher was very rarely wasted. Sometimes it was simply eaten by the diner who'd been using it. But very often it was instead collected up and given away as alms to the poor waiting at the gate, or passed down to the servants of the household. So the leftovers of the Lord's rich and spice-laden table quite literally trickled downward, sodden with gravy and grease, to feed those lower in the household, and beyond its walls, a small daily flow of charity carried on stale bread. Fact 54. Diners in the Great Hall typically shared a good deal more than we would ever be comfortable with today. It was entirely common for two people to eat together from a single trencher or platter, to share one salt cellar between them, and even to share a single drinking cup, passing it back and forth. Dining was an intimate, cooperative, sociable act, and the medieval manners guides of the period devoted an enormous amount of careful attention to the proper etiquette of sharing food gracefully, cleanly, and courteously with the person seated right beside you. Fact 55. As for utensils, the fork was essentially unknown in this world, and on the rare occasions when one did appear, it was often regarded as something strange, foreign, and even faintly distasteful, an unnecessary affectation. The three main tools of eating were the spoon, the knife, and most of all, the fingers. And of those three, the fingers were very probably used most often of all, which meant that eating well, neatly, cleanly, without greasing your sleeve or your neighbor, was itself a genuine and valued social skill, something a well-bred person learned young. Fact 56. Because so very much of the eating was done directly by hand, finger bowls were an absolute essential at any proper table. Diners were expected to rinse their fingers frequently in bowls of clean water throughout the course of the meal, keeping their hands relatively clean between one dish and the next. Good manners in this world were, in part, quite literally a matter of visible hygiene, performed openly and correctly at the table, in full view of everyone else, as a sign of one's breeding and care. Fact 57. And there was one particular object on the table that mattered enormously as a marker of rank: the salt cellar. It was often a large, elaborate, even castle-shaped vessel, set down at a specific place along the board, and where you sat in relation to it, announced your importance to the entire company at a glance. Those of noble blood, or those holding high office, sat above the salt, up nearer the host and the head of the table. Everyone else sat below the salt, further down. Your simple physical distance from a single dish of seasoning was, quite precisely, the measure of your distance from power itself. Now we arrive at the great myth of the whole period, the deeply held belief that the Anglo-Saxon and early medieval elite gorged themselves on mountains of meat every single day, while everyone beneath them went without. Because in 2022, science took a serious, rigorous look at this old idea. And what it found was genuinely, delightfully surprising. Fact 58. A bioarchaeologist named Sam Leggett analyzed the chemical signatures preserved deep in the bones of 2,023 different people who had been buried in England between the 5th and the 11th centuries. And this is a powerful thing to be able to do, because a person's bones quietly record the long-term story of what they actually ate over the years of their life, in a way that no chronicle, no proud feast list, no boastful record ever could. She was looking, specifically and carefully, for the chemical fingerprint of a heavy, sustained, meat-rich diet. Fact 59. She then compared those chemical signatures against the apparent social status of each individual, judged from the goods buried with them, the position of the body, and the orientation of the grave. The logic was simple and sound. If the rich had truly eaten far more meat than the poor, day in and day out across their whole lives, then it really ought to have shown up clearly and unmistakably in the very bones of the elite. The dietary evidence, if the old story were true, should have been impossible to miss. Fact 60, but it simply wasn't there. The study found no correlation whatsoever between high social status and a high-protein, meat-heavy diet. None. The isotopic evidence instead suggested that everyday diets in this period were far more similar across the different social groups than historians had ever assumed or imagined. The great lord and the humble laborer, it turned out, ate surprisingly alike from one ordinary day to the next, a genuinely startling conclusion that quietly overturns centuries of assumption. Fact 61. In fact, Leggett found no evidence at all of anyone eating enormous amounts of animal protein on a regular, sustained basis. Because if the elite really had feasted on great quantities of meat every day, their bones would carry the telltale chemical marks of all that excess protein, and very likely they would also show the physical signs of diseases like gout, the so-called rich man's disease. But those markers were, for the most part, simply absent from the record. The everyday early medieval diet, for rich and poor alike, appears to have been mostly plant-based, with only a small, modest amount of animal protein woven through it here and there. Fact 62. So the real, everyday picture, even for the elites, even for the lords in their fine halls, looks something remarkably like this. Bread, accompanied by a small quantity of meat and cheese, and pottages of leeks and whole grains flavored with just a little meat for depth. which means that the Lord's ordinary daily table, once you strip away the glittering myth, actually looked far more like the peasant's humble wooden bowl than almost anyone had ever guessed. The real difference between them, it turns out, was much less about what they quietly ate every single day, and much more about the rare and spectacular exceptions. And those exceptions, the true feasts, bring us to one of the most delightful discoveries of all. But to understand them fully, we need to step into two very particular worlds: the quiet cloister of the monk and the great hall of the king. Let's take the monks first. Push open the heavy door of a monastery dining hall, the refectory as it was called, and you step into a world governed not by hunger and not by status, but by rules. Careful, written, endlessly examined and debated rules about exactly what a holy man was and was not permitted to put into his mouth. This is a quiet, ordered, echoing place, with long tables and plain benches, where the brothers eat in silence while one of their number reads aloud from scripture. And the whole story of monastic food is, above all else, the story of those rules, and just as much, the story of the wonderfully human and inventive ways that people found over the centuries to gently bend them. Fact 63. The foundational document for very much of this was the Rule of Saint Benedict, written around the year 516 by Benedict of Nursia, a Roman nobleman who had turned his back on the city and gone out to worship in isolation. His rule went on to shape nearly every single aspect of monastic life for centuries to come, and it laid down, in remarkable and specific detail, not only how a monk should pray and how many hours he should sleep, but precisely what he should eat, and in exactly what quantities. Fact 64. At the very heart of Benedict's dietary rule sat a single, striking prohibition. Monks were forbidden to eat the flesh of four-legged animals. No beef, no pork, no mutton, no venison, none of it. Benedict himself was a devoted champion of a far simpler fare: black bread, plain water, greens, and humble vegetables. The holy life, in his vision of it, was meant to be a plain-tasting one, deliberately stripped of richness and indulgence. Fact 65. And there was a genuine, considered philosophy behind all this restraint. It was firmly believed that a rich diet inflamed the senses and stirred up greed and lust, which made it a direct and dangerous threat to a monk's solemn vow of chastity. There was a very practical concern woven in there too. A full, well-fed monk was inevitably a sleepy monk, and a sleepy monk was in no fit state at all to pray for the long hours that his calling demanded. Plain food, the reasoning went, kept both the soul and the body properly disciplined and alert. Fact 66. Benedict's plan set the entire rhythm of monastic eating according to the turning of the seasons and the length of the days. Monks were to eat just a single meal a day through the winter, when the daylight was short and the work was less. And they were to add a second, lighter meal during the long, bright days of summer. In the cloister, quite literally, the turning of the light itself governed the turning of the meals. Fact 67. A typical monastic meal offered the brother a modest choice of 2 cooked dishes, thoughtfully arranged so that a monk who genuinely couldn't stomach the one might still eat the other and not go hungry. These dishes were vegetable or cereal-based, and they might include a modest amount of fish or perhaps some egg. Add to that the daily ration of bread and maybe a little fruit in season, and you have the quiet, careful, deliberately unexciting shape of the monastic table. Fact 68. The characteristic dishes of the refectory were bread, grains, legumes, eggs, cheese, fruit, and vegetables, and the single most common seasoning of all was simply salt. Peas and broad beans, so beloved right across Britain and France, appeared on the table constantly. And pottage, that great universal dish of the entire medieval world, very likely played a starring role here in the cloister too, murmuring in its pot, just as it did in every peasant's hut and every lord's kitchen. Now, human nature being what it eternally is, these strict rules did not stay strict for terribly long. The history of monastic food is, in very large part, the wonderfully human history of increasingly ingenious and creative loopholes. Fact 69. Benedict had banned meat, yes, but he had said nothing whatsoever about where a genuinely sick monk ought to recover his strength. And so monasteries built a special room called the Misericord, set apart from the main refectory, where infirm and ailing monks were permitted to eat meat in order to rebuild their strength and health. The trouble, entirely predictably, was that perfectly healthy monks soon discovered they could simply wander off and retire to the Misericord whenever they happened to fancy a bit of meat. The loophole had a door, and that door stood conveniently and permanently open. Fact 70. The theological hair-splitting could get truly, wonderfully creative. Since the ban was specifically on the flesh of four-legged animals, some monks reasoned quite earnestly that they could therefore still eat the offal and the entrails, the liver, the tripe, the innards, just not the actual muscle meat itself. Others decided, after due reflection, that meat which had been cooked twice no longer really counted as meat at all, a ruling that conveniently opened the door to things like meatballs and rissoles, even while a plain roasted steak remained strictly forbidden. The mind, when hungry, is a marvelously flexible instrument. Fact 71. At Christ Church in Canterbury, in the late 12th century, the monks arrived at a particularly splendid conclusion. Soup made from meat was perfectly fine and permissible. The meat itself might be off limits, but the broth, apparently, simply didn't count against the rule. It's a beautiful and rather endearing example of the sheer mental gymnastics that hungry, disciplined, well-meaning men will happily perform when a single rule stands between them and the prospect of a genuinely good meal. Fact 72. And perhaps the most famous single piece of reasoning of all grew out of the theological argument that certain birds were essentially aquatic creatures, that they belonged, in their deep nature, more to the water and to the world of fish than to the land and the world of fowl, and could therefore be quite properly eaten on fast days, when the flesh of land animals was strictly banned. This kind of imaginative, generous reasoning helped make all sorts of dishes that felt like real treats entirely acceptable, at least within the strict letter of the law, if perhaps not always within its original spirit. Let's talk for a moment about fish on its own, because fish tells its own quietly fascinating story in the monastic world. Fact 73. In the very earliest monastic rules, fish wasn't part of fasting at all, quite the opposite, in fact. It was mentioned as an indulgence, a small and welcome luxury. But over the passing centuries, as the rules gradually loosened and softened, fish slowly drifted from being a treat to being the very definition of fasting food itself. By the later medieval period, a fish day and a fast day had become very nearly one and the same thing in people's minds. What had begun its life as a luxury had, slowly and quietly, become the rule itself, a wonderful reversal that says a great deal about how these things evolve. Fact 74. This gentle softening happened right across the many different monastic rules over the long course of time. If you line up the successive rules one after another, from Augustine onward down the centuries, you can actually watch the whole trend unfold before you. A gradual, almost imperceptible relaxation of the old severity and austerity, with more and more foods quietly creeping in, and the fasting itself growing steadily less harsh, generation by generation. The spirit, one imagines, remained willing throughout. But the menu kept on expanding. Fact 75. Some of the later rules became, by comparison to the old austerity, downright luxurious. The rule associated with Crowdgang, for instance, mentioned not merely meat, but bacon and cheese besides, and it included both wine and beer as a matter of course. Set that beside Benedict's original stock vision of plain black bread and plain water, and it reads very nearly like a feast. Abstinence, it seems, had a persistent and very human way of becoming remarkably comfortable over time. Fact 76. Wine held a special and slightly awkward place in the life of the cloister. In some communities, the monks argued quite seriously that they were practicing genuine restraint by only drinking wine on saints' days, except that there happened to be somewhere around 70 such saints' days, scattered generously throughout the year. That is, when you stop to count it, a very great many permitted occasions for a glass of wine. Restraint, it turns out, when it's defined generously enough, can end up looking an awful lot like indulgence. Fact 77. Beer and ale flowed freely in the monasteries too, and monastic brewing grew into a genuine tradition and a real and respected skill, one that some houses became quite famous for. One early rule, a version written specifically for women, even seems to treat beer as the ordinary default drink, with wine appearing instead as the rarer and more special treat. Right across the monastic world, these fermented grain drinks were woven deeply into the fabric of daily life, just exactly as they were everywhere else in this thirsty age. Fact 78. The very strictest rules, though, stood in sharp and deliberate contrast to all this creeping comfort. The rule of St. Columbanus, for one famous example, was notoriously severe, restricting the monk to just a single frugal meal a day in the name of self-denial and self-mortification. And even the diet itself bent to the shape of the liturgical calendar. During the long weeks of Lent, it grew plainer and more sparse still, while around the joy of Easter, it might blossom into something a little more generous and bountiful. Even the strictest of tables, it seems, breathed gently in and out with the sacred rhythm of the holy year. Fact 79. There's a real and rather delicious irony threaded all through this whole story. Even as the monks earnestly debated meat and offal and twice-cooked rissoles, some of their permitted fasting rations were, frankly, quite luxurious in themselves. Good fish, wine, spiced dishes on the feast days. The line between abstinence and abundance in a wealthy and well-endowed monastery could grow very blurry indeed. Holiness, it turned out, did not always and necessarily mean going hungry. Fact 80, and this brings us to a genuinely important point about the entire period. because of the church's countless fast days, and this applied not just within the monasteries, but to ordinary lay people everywhere. A great many medieval people, holy or not, quite simply did not eat meat every day. The steady, recurring rhythm of religious abstinence shaped the diet of an entire civilization, quietly turning a large share of the days of the year into days of fish, vegetables, and bread. The church calendar itself was, in a very real and practical sense, a kind of diet plan imposed gently over the whole of society. So we leave the refectory now, with its quiet murmur of prayer, its long, silent tables, and its wonderfully creative, deeply human theology of the dinner table. We've watched holy men wrestle earnestly with their own appetites, and more often than not, find some gentle and ingenious way to satisfy them without quite breaking the rules. And now, at last, we climb all the way to the very top. To the table of the king himself. There is perhaps no single image more deeply fixed in our collective imagination than the medieval royal feast. The king seated at the head of a vast and groaning table, tearing hungrily into a great joint of meat with his bare hands. Hounds sprawled beneath his feet waiting for scraps. Platters of roasted beasts stretching away into the smoky, torchlit distance. Goblets of wine overflowing all down the board. It is the picture that the very word, medieval, almost always conjures up in the mind. And here is where the science we met a little earlier delivers its most delightful and unexpected surprise of all. Because that vivid picture, it turns out, is somehow both entirely wrong and entirely right at the very same time, just not at all in the way that anyone had ever expected. Fact 81. For a very long time, historians simply assumed that Anglo-Saxon kings and their nobles ate vastly more meat than everyone else beneath them, sustained year-round by a system called feum, or food rent, an arrangement in which the free peasants were obliged to hand over food to feed and maintain their rulers throughout the whole year. It was understood as a permanent, standing, and rather exploitative arrangement, the laboring many endlessly feeding the feasting few day in and day out forever. Fact 82. But the bone chemistry study, we've already spent time with blew a very large hole right through this comfortable old idea. Since the isotopic evidence had clearly shown that the elites simply weren't eating meat-heavy diets on any regular basis, the entire notion of kings dining every single day on great mountains of flesh quietly collapsed. Their everyday eating, the patient evidence of the bones insisted, was actually much like everyone else's, mostly plants, with only a modest amount of animal protein. The king's ordinary, unremarkable weekday supper was, it seems, far humbler than the shining legend would ever have us believe. Fact 83. So the historian Tom Lambert turned instead to the surviving food lists, the actual itemized written records of feum that had come down to us, and he looked at them again with entirely fresh eyes. And he noticed something absolutely crucial about their sheer scale and their strange proportions. These were emphatically not the steady, sensible, week-by-week provisions of a household, simply eating its meals every day. They were something else altogether, something far stranger and grander. Fact 84. Take one specific and genuinely astonishing example. A single food list compiled during the reign of King Ini of Wessex, who ruled from the year 688 to 726, adds up altogether to more than 1 million calories of food in a single render. Let that number sit for a moment. That is not a week's worth of groceries for a royal household. That is a colossal, staggering, one-off mountain of provisions, clearly and unmistakably intended for a single, enormous, extraordinary gathering of people. Fact 85. And when you break that remarkable list down into its parts, the picture becomes wonderfully vivid. Alongside everything else it contained, the list included around 300 bread rolls. If every single guest at the feast received just one of those 300 rolls, then each of them would also have received something on the order of 4,000 additional calories of meat, fish, cheese, and honey besides. This was, quite plainly, a spread designed for a great crowd of people, all gorging themselves together in celebration on a single, spectacular, once-in-a-while day. Fact 86. And so, out of all this, a beautiful new interpretation gradually emerged. These food lists weren't blueprints for everyday royal eating at all. They never had been. They were provisions for occasional grand feasts, huge, exceptional, memorable events, rather than the quiet daily diet of the court. The kings, it turns out, weren't secretly hoarding great stores of meat and gorging on it all year round. They were, every so often, throwing absolutely enormous parties. Fact 87, and here is where the whole story becomes truly charming. The evidence strongly suggests that these great feasts weren't tribute grudgingly and bitterly extracted from downtrodden, resentful serfs at all. Instead, they look far more like communal feasts hosted by free peasants, land-owning farmers, people of genuine independent standing, for their traveling king. So picture, if you will, a monarch journeying slowly across his realm, arriving at a settlement, and being warmly treated to a colossal barbecue thrown in his honor by the local free farmers, proud to host their ruler. Fact 88. One of the researchers compared it, quite wonderfully, to a modern political campaign dinner, the sort of grand public event where a leader travels out to a community and is hosted, fed, and celebrated at a great shared meal. These feasts, in other words, were a crucial and deliberate form of political engagement, a way of binding king and people together through the powerful, ancient magic of shared abundance and hospitality. The feast, on this reading, wasn't exploitation at all. It was, in the most literal possible sense, politics that you could eat. Fact 89. And as one of the scholars rather dryly observed, we really shouldn't be too terribly surprised at the sheer, almost absurd quantity of meat recorded on those old lists. Anyone who has ever been to a barbecue where the enthusiastic hosts cooked a frankly ludicrous and unnecessary amount of food will recognize the impulse instantly. The best and choicest portions were probably eaten fresh and hot at the feast itself, and then the leftovers were very likely stewed up and eaten later in the following days. Human beings, it seems, have been cheerfully over-catering their celebrations for well over 1,000 years now. Fact 90. So the royal feast, exactly as we've always imagined it, was entirely and completely real. The roasted meats, the overflowing abundance, the sheer spectacle of it all. It simply wasn't an everyday reality. It was the glorious exception rather than the rule, a rare and dazzling break in a diet that, for the great majority of the time, looked really rather ordinary and plain. The whole magic of the feast lay precisely, and entirely, in the fact that it stood so far apart from the daily grind of bread and pottage that filled the rest of the year. Let's linger for a while on what actually happened at these great gatherings, at the royal and high noble feasts held right across the early medieval world. Fact 91. Feasting mattered so enormously partly because the ordinary times could be so very lean. In periods of war or hardship or shortage, there was often little enough to eat at all, and so the feast, with everything served in glorious abundance, became a genuine, heartfelt celebration of plenty, a deliberate and joyful contrast set against the constant low anxiety of everyday scarcity. To hold a feast was to declare aloud, if only for a single day, that here, now, there was enough, and more than enough, for everyone. Fact 92. The very grandest of these feasts were theatrical events in their own right, carefully built around multiple courses and designed, above all else, to impress and to astonish. There might be spectacular food sculptures, live music, and entertainment between the courses, and particular dishes chosen quite deliberately for their sheer drama and visual effect, as much as for anything they offered to the tongue. Dining at this exalted level was a kind of performance art, and the king or the great lord was, all at once, both the generous host and the shining star of the show. Fact 93. The most theatrical dishes of all were the great showbirds. Swan and peacock were brought out and served on only the most special of occasions, and sometimes the peacock was very carefully skinned, then roasted, and then painstakingly redressed in its own magnificent iridescent feathers before being carried aloft to the table in a grand procession. The entire goal of the exercise was to make the assembled diners gasp aloud in wonder before they had so much as tasted a single bite of the thing. Fact 94. And the very wealthiest tables of all could reach for genuinely exotic and astonishing flesh. The records mention the elite consuming creatures like seals, porpoises, and even whales, great sea beasts that the vast majority of ordinary people would never so much as encounter in their whole lives, let alone actually sit down and eat. And the logic here was simple and unchanging. The rarer and the stranger the animal upon the platter, the more powerfully and unmistakably it announced the sheer reach, the wealth, and the far-flung power of the one who had managed to serve it. Now let's touch, before we close, on the world beyond the Great Hall, because far to the north, among the Norse and the Vikings of this very same era, a whole parallel food culture was quietly flourishing, and it richly deserves its own place in our story. Fact 95. For the Norse of Scandinavia, the true backbone of the everyday diet was exactly the same as it was very nearly everywhere else across this world: grain. Barley, oats, and rye were quite simply life itself, cooked most often into porridge and into boiled cereals of various kinds. Alongside this came bread, and crucially, dairy in abundance. The real daily menu of most Norse people was built far more upon groats, bread, and milk products than upon the great slabs of roasted meat of the popular Viking stereotype. The fierce raider of legend went about his day, more often than not, on a belly full of porridge. Fact 96. And the Norse were absolute masters of dairy. From their milk they made whey, buttermilk, butter, curds, and cheese, and most famously of all, skyr, a soft, sour, yogurt-like fresh cheese, naturally low in fat and high in protein, which is still made and eaten in Iceland to this very day, more than 1,000 years on. Even the sour whey left over from the process didn't go to waste. It served as a preservative, used to keep cooked meats safely through the long, dark northern winter. Very little indeed of the precious milk was ever allowed to go to waste. Fact 97. Fish, quite naturally, was absolutely central in the north, and it was preserved there with real and hard-won skill. Herring was typically preserved by salting, while cod was preserved by drying, transformed into the hard, durable, long-lasting starkfish that could be stored for months and carried aboard ship on the longest of voyages. The cold sea was a vast and wonderfully reliable pantry for those who lived along its shores, and the Norse understood, better than almost anyone, exactly how to make its rich harvest last. Fact 98. For their drink, the Norse, just like everyone else in this thirsty era, relied first and foremost upon ale, which was consumed daily by men, women, and children alike, quite regardless of their status or their standing. But there was also a curious dairy-based alcoholic drink called sira, made as a byproduct of the skyr-making process, and exactly like the ale and the fruit wines of the region, it was originally brewed by women, quietly echoing the alewives of the wider medieval world far to the south. Fact 99. And then, above all these everyday drinks, there was mead, honey wine, made by slowly fermenting honey and water together. Mead was ancient, potent, sweet, and genuinely expensive, placing it far beyond the reach of most ordinary people. It was the drink of gods and of kings. It was the drink of poets and of eloquence in the old sagas, and it was reserved for feasts, for ceremonies, and for the greatest of occasions. To serve out, the mead was understood to be both the solemn duty and the high privilege of a lord. It was, in a very real sense, the celebratory champagne of the entire Viking world, poured out to mark the moments that truly mattered. And so, at last, we arrive at our 100th and final fact, the one that quietly gathers up the whole long thread of this journey and ties it gently together. Fact 100. For all the great differences we have traveled through together, the peasant's endless simmering pottage and the king's million-calorie feast, the monk's forbidden meat and the noble's glittering golden saffron, the alewife's weak and homely brew and the great lord's fine imported wine, there was, in the end, one single quiet truth that ran beneath every single table in the entire early medieval world. Cereal grains were the foundation of very nearly everyone's diet, quite regardless of their rank or their wealth. By some estimates, grain made up as much as 3/4 of everything an ordinary person ate. Bread, porridge, pottage, ale, in the end, absolutely everything came back, always and inevitably, to the humble grain growing quietly in the field. From the poorest cottage in the valley to the very highest hall on the hill, the so-called Dark Ages were, quietly and fundamentally and always, an age of grain. So there it is, 100 small facts, gathered slowly and carefully from the fields, the halls, and the quiet cloisters of a world we only ever thought we knew. And what have we truly found in all of that supposed darkness? Not the grim, colorless, endless famine of the old legend. Instead, we found a world of surprising variety, of quiet resourcefulness, and of real ingenuity. A world where a single humble pot could feed a whole family across a lifetime. A world where women built some of the very first small businesses out of nothing but barley, water, and yeast. A world where holy men argued with wonderful, earnest seriousness about whether a chicken might secretly, deep down, be a kind of fish. A world where kings, far from selfishly hoarding their meat, actually traveled the length of their realms to attend enormous barbecues thrown in their honor by proud free farmers, and where the real difference between a peasant and a lord, on most ordinary days of the year, was very much smaller than anyone had ever imagined. The people of the early Middle Ages ate to survive. Of course they did. But they also ate to celebrate, and to worship, and to heal themselves, and to belong to one another, and to say, without ever speaking a single word aloud, exactly who they were and where they stood. Their food was their calendar, and their medicine, and their politics, and their memory, all of it simmering gently together in one dark part over one endless, patient fire. Think back over the ground we've covered tonight. We began beside a peasant's fire, watching a single pot that never truly stopped simmering, carrying a family from one grey day to the next. We learned that the humble pottage in that pot has been red, 1,000 years later, straight from the grease still clinging to broken shards of clay. We tore dark maslin bread, and we discovered that in the hungriest years, people stretched their flour with acorns and even bark, just to survive the winter. We met the alewives, brewing safe, sustaining ale in their homes, and building, out of barley and patience, some of the first small independent livelihoods a woman in that world could ever claim as her own. Then we climbed the hill. We warmed ourselves at the Lord's great fire and expected to find a world entirely apart, and in some ways we did, with its venison and its saffron and its imported wine, its salt cellar measuring rank right there on the table. But then the bones of 2,000 long-dead people quietly told us something astonishing, that on most ordinary days, the Lord and the laborer ate very much alike, both of them living mostly on grain and vegetables, both of them saving the great meat feasts for rare and special occasions. The gulf between them, so vast in our imagination, narrowed to almost nothing over an ordinary bowl of pottage. We stepped into the hushed refectory of the monks and found there some of the most wonderfully human moments of the whole journey, holy men wrestling with their own appetites and arguing with the greatest of seriousness that a broth didn't count as meat, or that a barnacle goose was really a kind of fish, or that a quick trip to the infirmary might just earn a brother a plate of something forbidden. Their loopholes weren't hypocrisy so much as they were the eternal, gentle, familiar tension between our high ideals and our very ordinary hunger. And finally we climbed all the way to the king's own table, and there we found the biggest surprise of all waiting for us. The great meat feast of legend turned out to be entirely real, but it was a rare and dazzling exception, not a daily indulgence. And more than that, it wasn't the grim tribute of oppressed serfs at all. It was, as best we can now tell, a genuine celebration. Free farmers hosting their traveling king at an enormous barbecue, binding ruler and ruled together through the ancient, universal magic of a shared meal. Politics you could taste, loyalty you could chew. Along the way we watched people salt and smoke and dry their food against the coming dark, believing all the while that they were tending the invisible balance of hot and cold, wet and dry, within the food and within themselves. We watched the church's calendar of fasts and feasts lay its steady rhythm over the whole of society, turning great swathes of the year into quiet days of fish and vegetables and bread. And beneath every single thing we saw, at every level, we found the same humble foundation waiting patiently: grain, always grain. The barley and the oats and the rye and the wheat growing green in the field, standing between an entire civilization and the abyss. That, in the end, is what the darkness of the Dark Ages really hid. Not emptiness, not mere misery, but a whole world of ordinary people working with enormous ingenuity and care to feed themselves and one another season after season, generation after generation, using little more than a pot, a fire, a field, and a great deal of hard-won knowledge. It is easy, so very easy, to look back across 1,000 years and to see only shadow. But if you look just a little closer at something as simple and as ordinary and as deeply human as a shared meal among friends, you find that the light was quietly there all along. It was simply glowing softly and steadily right at the bottom of a plain wooden bowl. So the next time you sit down to eat, whatever's on your plate, however grand or humble, you might spare a thought for all of them. For the peasant stirring the pot before dawn, for the alewife at her brewing, for the monk eyeing the misericord, for the king at his once-a-year feast, and the free farmer proud to host him. 1,000 years gone now, all of them, and yet joined to us by the oldest and simplest thread there is, the daily human need to eat and the quiet pleasure of sharing it. Thank you for wandering through it all with me tonight. Sleep gently and rest well.